The word hit Virginia Bristol like a fist to the sternum. Not good. She stood at the far end of her harvest table, fingers white-knuckled around the edge of the worn oak, staring at the man who had appeared on her doorstep 3 days ago like something the Kansas prairie had coughed up and forgotten to reclaim. He sat there with the absolute stillness of someone who had learned long ago that stillness kept you alive, his dark eyes level and unapologetic, his hands flat on the table as if he were pressing the wood down to stop it from rising up against him. "Not a good man," she repeated, and her voice was dangerously quiet in the way that women's voices get when the anger runs too deep for volume. "You are sitting at my table, eating bread that I baked with my own flour, drinking coffee from my last tin, telling me you are not a good man. After everything you have already done here, after what happened last night." Joel Rhodes did not flinch. He did not apologize. He simply looked at her with those unreadable storm-gray eyes and said it again, slower, as if she had misunderstood the first time. "I am not a good man, Virginia, but I am a useful one." The fire in the hearth popped and sent a spray of orange sparks against the iron grate. Outside, the October wind was stripping the last gold leaves from the 2 cottonwoods at the edge of her property, and somewhere far out on the flat dark land, a coyote called and was not answered. Virginia felt the sound of it settle somewhere in her chest where old grief lived. She wanted to throw him out. She had been telling herself she wanted to throw him out for 3 days running, since the moment he had knocked on her door with dried blood on his collar, and a horse that was not his own, asking for water and offering nothing except that strange, steady quality of presence that made the air feel different around him. She wanted to be done with him and his dark past and his deliberately offered half-truths, and the way he looked at her cornfields in the early morning like they contained something sacred that he had no right to be near. But her hired man was dead. Her only neighbor was dead, and Silas Cutter's men were coming back. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down hard, and the harvest table between them felt like both a shield and an altar. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not pieces. Not the version where you are still the mystery. All of it. If you want to sit in that chair and call yourself useful, then you owe me the truth." Joel Rhodes looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since he had arrived on her land, something shifted behind his eyes, something that was not quite vulnerability but was its near neighbor. "All right," he said quietly. "All right, Virginia." And so she learned how the two of them had arrived at this table and at this terrible and necessary choice. It had been the 17th of October, 1882, when Joel Rhodes rode into the county of Garfield in southwestern Kansas, and the land was just barely holding onto its harvest colors. The sky that afternoon had been the particular shade of pale blue that only appears over the high plains in autumn, enormous and indifferent, pressing down on the flat earth like a hand. He had been riding for 4 days straight from Dodge City, where he had done something he was not proud of in the service of a man he was even less proud of, and he was heading nowhere with the dedicated intention of someone who believes that nowhere is the only honest destination available to him. Virginia Bristol's farm appeared on his left at about 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing he noticed was that the cornfield was unharvested, and it was already past the 3rd week of October. That struck him as wrong in the way that something structurally unsound strikes a man who has built things with his hands. Corn left standing that late in a Kansas autumn was corn that would be lost to the first killing frost, and from the look of the sky, that frost was maybe 2 nights away. The second thing he noticed was the woman herself, standing at the edge of the field with her arms crossed and her jaw set in that particular way that told him she was not sad. She was furious. There is a difference, and Joel Rhodes had learned it the hard way. He pulled his horse to a stop on the road. She did not look at him. She was staring into the field as if she could harvest it with sheer angry will, as if the anger were a tool she had not yet figured out how to wield precisely enough. He should have ridden on. He had been riding on from things his whole adult life, and he was 31 years old, and it had kept him breathing. But there was something about the image of that unharvested corn and that furious woman that hooked itself into the back of his sternum and refused to let him ride on past it. "You need help with that," he called across the road. She turned and looked at him, and her eyes were the color of good river water in summer, that clear deep green-brown that shifts as you watch it, and she looked at him with the frank and fearless appraisal of someone who has been alone long enough to have stopped being politely oblique about it. "Can you harvest?" she said. Not hello. "Not who are you?" "I have before," he said. "My hired man did not show up this morning," she said, and there was something clipped in it, something she was not telling him. "I can feed you and give you a place in the barn." Joel Rhodes looked at the field. He looked at the woman. He looked at the sky. "All right," he said. He dismounted, tied his horse at her fence post, and that was how it began. Her name was Virginia Bristol, and she had been on that land for 6 years, the first 4 with her husband Thomas and the last 2 alone. Thomas Bristol had died of a fever in the summer of 1880, which was the kind of death that felt unfair even by the standards of a place and time where unfair deaths were the common currency of daily life. He had been a good man in the straightforward way that some men manage without particular effort, and Virginia had loved him in the uncomplicated way that made his loss feel like the removal of a load-bearing wall. She had stayed on the land because the land was hers, and because she was not a woman who walked away from things she had built, and she had learned to do everything that needed doing with her own 2 hands and whatever help she could afford to hire. What she did not tell Joel Rhodes that first afternoon, what she had not told anyone except her friend Martha Elkins 2 counties over, was that Silas Cutter had been sending men around. Silas Cutter owned the ranch that bordered her property to the south and west, 3,000 acres of hard-won range that he had spent 15 years building through methods that occupied the ambiguous territory between hard dealing and outright theft. He was a man of 53 with the physical presence of someone who had once been very strong and had not entirely lost it, with a gray beard kept trimmed with a precision that somehow implied menace. He wanted Virginia's land because her land sat on top of the only natural spring in the county that he had not yet absorbed into his holdings, and for 3 months he had been pursuing what he called negotiation, which meant sending men to her farm to suggest in various creative ways that selling was the only sensible course. 2 weeks ago, the suggestion had shifted from creative to direct. One of his men had ridden through her fence and led her 3 remaining cattle out onto the open range, and it had taken Virginia 2 days to find them all. A week ago, her hired man, a young fellow named Pete Dawson who had come west from Missouri with big ideas and a sweet disposition, had taken her to the side and told her quietly that Cutter's foreman had come to see him in town and offered him twice his current wages to leave her employ. Pete, to his credit, had refused, but he had looked frightened when he told her, and frightened in a way that suggested the foreman had done more than simply offer money. 3 days ago, Pete had not come to work. She had ridden to town herself to check on him and found his boarding house room cleared out, his landlady unsurprised, his forwarding address non-existent. He was simply gone, the way that young men with big ideas and sweet dispositions go when they discover that the West is not what the stories told them it was. So she was alone, with an unharvested field and a spring that a powerful and dangerous man wanted, and the sky was turning towards frost. And then a drifter had appeared on the road. Joel Rhodes worked that first afternoon with an efficiency that impressed her against her will. He was tall, perhaps an inch over 6 feet, with the kind of lean, hard build that comes from years of sustained physical labor rather than deliberate exercise, and he worked through the corn rows with a methodical focus that told her this was not his first harvest even if farming had not been his primary occupation. She worked beside him, and they did not talk much, which she was grateful for. She was not in a mood to be charming, and she suspected he was not either. By the time the sun touched the horizon, they had cleared perhaps a third of the field. He helped her store what they had cut in the barn, and she brought out bread and cold beans and coffee, and they sat on her porch steps in the fading light and ate without ceremony. "You are passing through," she said. It was not quite a question. "That is generally what I do," he said. "Where from?" "Dodge City most recently." She had been born in Virginia, which was how she had come by her name, and she had traveled west with Thomas 7 years ago with the optimism of people who believe that distance from the past is the same thing as freedom from it. She knew enough about the world to understand what Dodge City most recently meant in the context of a man with dried blood on his collar who gave his labor in exchange for barn lodging without any particular negotiation. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked. He looked at her sidelong. "Whatever kind is available." That was not a full answer, and they both knew it. But she did not press, because she had a third of a cornfield left to harvest, and she needed this man's hands more than she needed his biography. She told him he could sleep in the barn, showed him where the water pump was, and went inside. She lay awake for an hour, aware of the strange presence in her barn, aware of how long it had been since anyone had slept on her property, aware that she was making calculations about trust that she could not fully articulate. The next morning he was already at the cornfield when she came out. They finished the harvest by midday of the second day. She had been watching him the whole time, not obviously, but with the peripheral attention of someone making a continuous assessment. He was careful. He was precise. He did not waste motion. He treated her tools as if they were his own and her land as if it deserved respect, which was a thing she had not expected. That second afternoon, he began to load the harvested corn onto her wagon to take it to the storage barn at the back of the property, and she was coming around the side of the house when she heard hooves on the road. There were two of them. She recognized them from the month before, Cutter's men, a broad fellow named Garrett and a thin, sharp-featured one whose name she had never been given. They stopped on the road and looked at the farm with the proprietary assessment of men who have been told they are going to own something. "Miss Bristol," Garrett called out. He had a voice like a boot scraping gravel. "Mr. Cutter was hoping to hear from you this week." "Mr. Cutter knows where to find me," she said. "He is welcome to come speak to me himself. He is a busy man." "So am I," she said. Garrett's eyes moved to Joel, who had stopped his work and was standing beside the wagon with a sack of corn over one shoulder, watching the road with no particular expression. There was something in that stillness that Garrett clearly registered because his tone shifted slightly, recalibrated. "Who is that?" Garrett said. "My hand," Virginia said. Joel did not confirm or deny this. He simply stood there with that particular quality of stillness that Virginia was beginning to understand was not passivity at all, but something more like coiled readiness. Garrett and the thin man exchanged a look. Then Garrett touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was not politeness but its outward approximation, and they rode on. Virginia let out a breath she had not realized she had been holding. That evening, she told Joel about Sela's Cutter. She told him about the spring and the land and the 3 months of pressure and Pete Dawson's sudden disappearance. She told him because it seemed irresponsible not to, if he was going to be on her property and visible to Cutter's men, and also because she had a feeling that the truth was something he would respect more than a managed version of events. He listened without interruption, and when she was finished he said, "How long have you got before he moves from pressure to something harder?" The question startled her with its directness. "I do not know," she said. "You should assume soon," he said. "Men like that have a timetable." "I know," she said. "I am not naive." "I did not say you were." The fire was burning low. She added another piece of wood and did not look at him when she asked the next question. "What kind of work did you do in Dodge City?" A pause, long enough to be an answer in itself. "I worked for a man named Beaumont," he said. "Ran money between the stockyards and certain gambling establishments, and he needed people who could make sure the money arrived where it was supposed to." "Hired protection," she said. "Sometimes. Sometimes I was hired to go find people who had taken what was Beaumont's. And you found them." "I found them." She looked at him then. He was looking at the fire, his jaw set, and she could see the complicated relationship he had with what he was saying written plainly on his face. He was not proud of it. He was also not pretending it had not happened. "What happened 3 days ago?" she asked. "The blood on your collar." Beaumont decided he wanted more than his money back from a man who owed him. He wanted an example made. Joel's voice was flat and even. "I was not willing to make that particular example. We disagreed about this in a way that made continued employment impossible. You left. I left before he could do more than nick my collar. I took the horse because the horse he owed me was already sold." She sat with this for a while. The fire popped. The wind moved outside. "So you are running," she said. "I prefer to think of it as moving forward," he said, and there was something very slightly dry in it, almost humor, almost the first humor she had heard from him. She smiled before she could stop herself. It was a small smile, involuntary, and she felt it with some surprise, as if her own face had done something without her permission. He saw it, and she saw him see it, and then they were both looking at the fire again with great attention. "You can stay through the week," she said. "There is work that needs doing around the property, and the spring needs checking, and I would be a fool to turn away a capable hand when I know Cutter's men are going to be back." "I am not a good man to have around if things turn dangerous," he said. "I am not a good man, period. I want to be honest with you about that." "I am not asking you to be good," she said. "I am asking you to be here." He looked at her then, and there it was for the first time, that thing beneath the surface of his composure, that recognition, as if she had said something that struck at the center of a question he had been carrying a very long time. "All right," he said. He stayed. The third day was when things broke open, and it happened so fast that Virginia was still trying to catch up with events when she found herself at her harvest table across from Joel Rhodes with the night dark outside the windows and something irrevocable in the air between them. It had started at dawn. She had gone out to check the spring, which was a natural seep on the northeast corner of her property, not dramatic to look at but steady, the water clear and cold year-round, surfacing between two flat limestone outcroppings and running south into a little creek bed that kept the near pasture green through summer. It was the kind of thing you could easily walk past if you did not know what you were looking for. She had not walked past it. She had built her life around it. She was kneeling at the edge of the seep checking the output, which she did every week, when she heard the sound of horses behind the tree line to the east. Not the road, which was to the west. The east, which was open range that technically belonged to no one, which Cutter would know perfectly well. She stood up. She did not run. She looked. There were 4 of them, and Garrett was among them, and so was a man she had not seen before, tall and dark-coated, riding a black horse with the assurance of someone who gives orders rather than receives them. Later she would learn his name was Decker, and he was Cutter's foreman, the man who had frightened Pete Dawson into disappearing. They stopped at the property line, which was marked by a line of fence posts that she and Thomas had put in themselves, 6 years ago, in the first autumn of their time on this land. "Virginia Bristol," Decker called out. His voice carried easily across the flat ground. It was the voice of a man who knows that what he says will be acted upon. "Mr. Cutter has come to the end of his patience," Decker said. "He is prepared to make a final offer, $2,000 for the land and the water rights. That is a generous offer, Miss Bristol, and it will not be repeated." $2,000 was not a generous offer. The land was worth 3 times that, and the spring rights alone were worth at least that again. "Tell Mr. Cutter I am not selling," she said. Decker's expression did not change. "That answer is going to create problems for you," he said. "Practical problems." "Then those are my problems," she said. Decker looked at her for a long moment, then looked at the spring, and the look he gave the spring was more honest than anything he had said. It was a look of pure want, undisguised, and she felt the danger of it with a clarity that was almost physical. He turned his horse without another word, and the 4 of them rode back into the eastern tree line and were gone. She stood at the spring for a full minute, her hands very steady, her heart pounding. Then she walked back to the house. Joel was in the barn. She told him what had happened and he listened, and when she was done he said, "How far is the nearest town?" "Barrow Creek, 8 miles north." "Is there a marshal?" "There is a man named Hatcher who holds the title," she said, "but Cutter has been a financial supporter of the county seat for many years, and Marshal Hatcher has a flexible sense of jurisdiction." Joel absorbed this. "Are there people in town who respect you, who would stand for you?" She thought about it. The postmistress, Alma Garrett, though she is no relation to Cutter's man. The owner of the feed store, a man named Ellis. The Reverend Price. She paused. "It is not that people are against me. It is that Cutter is powerful, and people who are practical are careful about who they oppose." "That is how men like Cutter sustain themselves," Joel said, "right up until the moment they do not." "And what moment is that?" "When the cost of opposing them drops below the cost of tolerating them," he said, "usually because something changes." "What needs to change?" He looked at her steadily. "They need to see that you have someone who will not be moved." She held his gaze and felt the weight of what he was saying. "You said yourself you are not a good man," she said. "I know what men like Decker respect," he said. "It is not goodness." She made a decision then, standing in the barn door with the October sun at her back and the smell of horses and hay around her. She made it with the clarity of someone who has run out of other options, but also, she would realize later, with something that was not entirely tactical. "Then stay," she said. "Not just the week. Stay until this is resolved." He looked at her for a long moment, and she thought he would refuse because he was a man in the habit of leaving, and she could see the leaving instinct working in him, the familiar calculation of risk and freedom. "All right," he said. They ate dinner that evening at the harvest table, the two of them across from each other with the remains of a simple meal between them, and she felt the strangeness of another person's presence in her house in a way that was not discomfort. It was something older than discomfort, older even than grief. It was the simple and complicated fact of another human being present at the table where she had eaten alone for 2 years. She refilled his coffee. He said, "I want to tell you something." She sat down. He said, "I am not a good man, Virginia, but I am a useful one." And she looked at him, and the fire was burning, and outside the coyote called into the dark Kansas night, and she said, "Tell me everything." So he did. His name was Joel Rhodes, and he had been born in 1851 in a small town in Tennessee to a father who drank and a mother who endured, which was not an unusual story for that time and place, except that Joel had left at 15 rather than endure, and had gone west because west was where you went when you were 15 and running, and had nowhere else to go. He had worked cattle drives up from Texas, 3 of them before he was 20, and had learned in the process what he was good at, which was reading situations, reading men, reading the physics of conflict before it became physical. He was not naturally violent, but he had learned to be effective, and effectiveness without goodness is a particular kind of dangerous instrument. At 23, he had worked briefly for a land office in Colorado, and had discovered that the land office was engaged in systematic fraud against a Ute settlement, which was not unusual for the time, but was the specific injustice that Joel could not square with himself. He had done what he did, which was leave, but not before he had passed certain documents to a territorial newspaper editor who had printed a story that caused a federal investigation, which itself produced very little in the way of justice, but at least slowed the fraud by 6 months. He had been threatened for it, and he had left Colorado, and that had been the pattern of his life ever since, a series of places where he had done something useful, sometimes at genuine cost to himself, sometimes at moral cost, never purely clean. In Abilene, he had worked for a cattle baron named Whitmore, and left when he realized Whitmore was underpaying the Mexican vaqueros on his crew by a third, pocketing the difference and daring anyone to speak. Joel had spoken, which had ended his employment and reduced his options, which had led him eventually to Dodge City and Beaumont's operation, which had been the furthest he had traveled from his own moral center, and he had known it all along, and had told himself it was temporary, and it had taken the thing with the man Beaumont wanted made an example of to force his hand back to himself. He told her all of this. He told her in the plain and unsentimental way that men tell truths they have been carrying alone too long, not performing vulnerability but releasing a pressure that has become unsustainable. Virginia listened. She did not offer reassurance, which he did not want and would have distrusted. She listened with the focused intelligence of someone taking information seriously. When he was finished, she said, "The man Beaumont wanted made an example of. What did you do?" "I rode to his house and warned him," Joel said. "Gave him money for traveling and told him to be gone by morning. Beaumont's money, my wages for the month." She was quiet for a long time. The fire burned. The wind moved. "You are a complicated man," she said finally. "I'm not a good man," he said. "I heard you the first time," she said. "I think you are wrong, but I understand why you believe it, and I am not going to argue with you about it tonight." He looked at her with something startled in him, as if he had expected her to either validate the self-assessment or argue against it as a form of flattery, and instead she had done something else entirely. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I am going to sleep," she said. "And in the morning I am going to think about Sela's cutter and what needs to happen, and I am going to want your help thinking about it." "You have it," he said. She stood and then she stopped with her hand on the back of her chair and looked at him once more. "Thank you," she said, "for the corn, for staying." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." She went to bed, and she lay awake a long time, staring at the ceiling of the room where she had slept beside Thomas, and then alone for 2 years. And she tried to organize her thoughts about the situation with Cutter into something tactical, and instead found her thoughts organizing themselves around Joel Rhodes, around the cadence of his voice when he talked about Colorado, around the moment he had said the word temporary, and she had heard in it all the years of displacement that lived beneath the surface of his composure. She told herself firmly that this was not the time for that kind of thinking. She thought it anyway. In the morning he was at the kitchen table before her, and he had made coffee, which was so unexpected and so entirely welcome that she stood in the doorway for a moment before moving, simply absorbing the fact of a person in her kitchen making coffee in the early light. "I have been thinking," he said, pouring her a cup without being asked. "So have I," she said. They sat down together and spread it out between them like a map. The situation as it existed, the resources available, the constraints. "He will not stop," Joel said. "Men like Cutter do not recalibrate around a refusal. They find a way to make the refusal impossible to sustain." "I know," she said. "Which means the fence posts and threats are not the end. He will try something that compromises the property itself, or compromises you personally. He could move to contest the deed," she said. "My neighbor 2 properties over, Martin Greeley, died this spring, and there was some trouble with his deed that Cutter got involved in. I do not know the details, but I know Greeley's family lost the land. Or he could simply make it impossible to operate," Joel said. "No hired hands willing to work for you, buyers unwilling to buy your crop, the small suffocations. He has already started that," she said. "I had 3 men refuse work this fall before Pete." "Then the next step is harder," Joel said. "What about documentation of your deed?" "It is registered at the county seat. I have a copy." "Good. Who is the county recorder?" "A man named Ferris. I do not know his relationship with Cutter." Joel was quiet, thinking. His hands were wrapped around his coffee cup, and she noticed again what good hands they were, large and capable, the hands of someone who had done many different kinds of work. "Here is what I think," he said. "You need to make noise, not violence noise. You need people in this county to know that your situation exists, that Cutter is applying pressure, that you are resisting, and that you have someone on your side who is difficult to remove." "The someone being you," she said. "The someone being me," he said. "Decker is careful. He does the things that are hard to prove. But Decker works for a man who cares very much about how he appears, and public attention is something Cutter does not want." "The newspaper," she said. "There is a paper in Barrow Creek." "Who runs it?" "A woman named Edith Cross. She is not afraid of Cutter as far as I know." She wrote a piece last year about the conditions in the stockyards that did not make the ranching interests happy. That is where we start, Joel said. Virginia looked at him across the table, across the coffee cups and the early morning light, and felt something warm and alarming unfurl in her chest, something she had been steadfastly ignoring for 3 days, and that was becoming harder to ignore. He was watching her with that direct, serious attention, and she wondered if he had any idea what he looked like when he was thinking, when all the guardedness fell away from his face, and there was just the unmediated intelligence and something behind it that she was increasingly certain was not purely professional concern. "All right," she said. "We go to Barrow Creek." They rode in together that morning, Virginia on her own horse and Joel on the horse he had taken from Beaumont, which was a good animal regardless of its origins. The October sky was vast and pale above them, and the road north was empty, the prairie on either side of it the tawny gold of late autumn, and for a while they rode without talking, and it was not uncomfortable. "Do you know how to stay in one place?" she asked at some point. He glanced at her. "I know how to do most things if there is a reason for them." "Is that an answer?" "It is the honest one," he said. She looked ahead at the road and considered this. "Thomas, my husband, he loved this land from the first week," she said. "He used to go out in the early mornings just to stand in the field and look at it. I thought it was a little odd at first. I came around to understanding it." "What did he understand about it?" Joel said, and the question was genuine, not polite. "That it was his," she said. "Not in the sense of ownership, though that too. In the sense that he and the land had made an agreement with each other. He had given it his time and attention and effort, and it had given him a life, and that was a real relationship, a binding one." Joel rode in silence for a moment. "That is something I have not had," he said. "A place. That kind of agreement," he said. "With anything." She looked at him then, and the thought she had been refusing to finish for 3 days finished itself without her permission. He was not a man who had never needed anything. He was a man who had believed he was not entitled to it, which was a different and much sadder condition. She did not say this out loud. They were on their way to a newspaper office, and she needed her mind on the matter at hand. Barrow Creek was 8 miles of hard road, and arrived at it like most Kansas towns arrived at themselves, gradually and without fanfare. A water tower first, then a few outlying structures, then a main street of wood-fronted buildings that aspired to permanence without quite achieving it. It was a working town, a cattle town, the kind of place where commerce was the primary theology and everything else was negotiated around it. The Barrow Creek Courier operated out of a narrow building between the feed store and the land office, and Edith Cross was exactly what Virginia had suggested. A woman of about 50, with ink-stained fingers and a gimlet gaze that moved over Joel Rhodes with the assessment of someone who has been collecting information about human beings for decades and has few illusions left. "Virginia Bristol," she said, and it was a welcome, not a question. "I heard you were having trouble out your way." "News travels," Virginia said. "News is my profession," Edith said. "Come in." They sat in the newspaper office among the smell of ink and paper and the mechanical presence of the printing press at the back of the room, and Virginia laid out the situation clearly and factually. The pressure cutter had been applying, the specific incidents she could document, Decker's visit to the spring and his final offer. Edith listened and took notes on a small pad of paper. Her gaze moved between Virginia and Joel, and at some point she said, "And you are?" "Joel Rhodes," he said. "What is your involvement?" "I am working Virginia's land," he said. Edith held his gaze for a moment and Joel held hers back, and some kind of mutual assessment occurred that ended in Edith making a small nod and returning to her notes. "I can print the story," Edith said. "The intimidation campaign, the deed situation, the spring. If Cutter tries to move legally against you, a public record of the prior pressure will be relevant." "What about legally?" Joel said. "Is there a solicitor in this county who is not in Cutter's pocket?" "There is one in Wichita," Edith said. "A man named Holt. He handled the Meridian case 2 years ago, if you know it." "I do not," Virginia said. "Similar situation. Absentee cattle interest trying to absorb a smaller holding. Holt took it on contingency and won. Edith looked at Virginia. I can write to him. Please, Virginia said. They left the courier with the feeling of having done something that could not be undone, of having placed a fact into the public record that would now exist independently of their will. It was both frightening and clarifying. On the road back, they passed a group of riders going south, and two of them were Cutter's men, and they clocked Joel with the particular attention of men recalibrating a calculation. Joel rode past them without acknowledgement. They will tell Cutter, Virginia said when the riders were behind them. That is the point, Joel said. She thought about that. You are very deliberate, she said. I have spent a long time learning that impulsive men lose, he said. And deliberate men lose slower, he said, and again that dry near humor and again her involuntary smile. The weather changed that afternoon. A front moved in from the northwest with the abrupt seriousness of Kansas weather, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in 2 hours and the sky going from pale blue to a flat gray that pressed down on the land. By evening the wind was sharp and the air smelled of cold coming in for good, the first real suggestion of the winter that was already decided even if it had not yet arrived. Virginia made soup from the last of the autumn vegetables and they ate together again, and this time the meal was different. They had done something together that day, planned it and executed it, and the shared effort had shifted something in the atmosphere between them, had made the space at the table feel easier and also more fraught, in the way that closeness can make everything simultaneously more comfortable and more complicated. He told her about a harvest he had worked in Nebraska when he was 19, the first time he had been in a place long enough to see a thing through from beginning to end, and how that had felt. She told him about the first winter on this land, just her and Thomas, the blizzard that had lasted 3 days and how they had spent all of it by the fire playing cards and talking about what they were going to plant in the spring, all the things they were going to make of the place. Did you make them? He asked. Most of them, she said. Some of them we never got to. He was quiet for a moment. I am sorry you lost him, he said. It was simply said and she received it simply. Thank you, she said. The fire burned down. Neither of them moved to add wood, and eventually the only light was from the embers and the oil lamp on the table between them, and she was aware of his face in that light and aware of the particular quality of the silence, which was the kind of silence that contains things neither person has yet said. You should get some sleep, she said finally. Tomorrow is going to be complicated. Probably, he said. He got up, and he was close to her for a moment in the small space of the kitchen, close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him, the specific gravity of his presence. He stopped there and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them moved. Then he said quietly, "Good night, Virginia." "Good night," she said. He went out to the barn. She stood at the window for a long time after, watching the dark. The complications came the next morning in the form of 3 men who arrived before sunrise, which was the coward's hour for confrontation because it catches people between sleep and readiness. Virginia heard the horses first, which woke her, and she was already at the window in the gray pre-dawn light when she saw them dismounting in her yard. Decker was one of them. The other 2 she did not know. She was dressed and at the front door in under 2 minutes, and she had her husband's shotgun, which she knew how to use. Decker looked at the shotgun with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "Miss Bristol," he said, "we need to discuss the spring." "We discussed the spring," she said. "I gave you my answer. There is a question of the water rights registration," Decker said. "Mr. Cutter has located a prior claim that predates your deed." "That is a lie," she said. "That is a legal question," he said, smooth and certain. "One that Mr. Cutter intends to bring before the county court." She heard movement behind her, from the direction of the barn, and Joel appeared at the corner of the house. He had clearly also been awake because he was fully dressed and had his coat on, and he moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had anticipated this. He walked across the yard and stopped beside Virginia. Decker's arithmetic was visible on his face, updating. "Who filed the prior claim?" Joel said. What date, what document, what office? Decker looked at him. That will be established in the proceeding. You do not have a document, Joel said. You have a plan for a document. There is a difference. You are not a party to this, Decker said. I am employed on this land, Joel said, which makes me a material party to anything related to this land. This was not strictly legally accurate, but it was said with enough confidence that Decker was not in a position to contradict it without more certainty than he had. You would do well, Decker said slowly, to think carefully about your involvement here. Men in your position have very few resources when things become formal. Men in my position, Joel said, have very little to lose, which makes us very difficult to persuade. The two unnamed men were watching Joel with the reassessing eyes of men who understand physical fact, and the physical fact that Joel presented at that moment was a composed, absolutely unfrightened man who was clearly not going to be moved by anything short of force, and force in front of a witness on private property in broad daylight was a different calculation than nighttime intimidation. Decker made his calculation. He got back on his horse. Mr. Cutter's attorneys will be in contact, he said. We look forward to it, Joel said. They rode out. Virginia waited until they were off the property before she let out a long breath and lowered the shotgun. A prior claim, she said. A fabrication, Joel said, but a legal one, which is the kind that requires a counter. We need that solicitor from Wichita. Edith is writing to him today. Good. She looked at him, standing in her yard in the gray morning light with his coat collar up against the cold, and she thought, without any defense against the thought, that she had never in 2 years of widowhood looked at another person and thought, I am glad you are here, with such uncomplicated intensity. The days that followed had a particular quality that Virginia would remember for the rest of her life, the quality of something being built, though she could not have said precisely what. There was the practical business of the land and Cutter's manufactured legal claim, which Edith Cross addressed in a front-page piece in the Courier that created the public noise Joel had calculated, which in turn brought the solicitor Holt to Barrow Creek within a week. A brisk and competent man who reviewed Virginia's deed documents with the focused attention of someone who knows what fraud looks like, and was gratified to find that the fraud in this case had been attempted sloppily. Cutter's claim is fabricated, Holt told them, sitting at Virginia's harvest table one evening. The date on the document he is citing postdates a court decision that would have made such a claim impossible. Whoever prepared it made a fundamental error. He looked at Virginia. I can have this dismissed within 30 days. And Cutter himself, Virginia said. His methods create liability, Holt said. The intimidation campaign, the interference with your hired labor, the trespass, all of this is documentable, and with the public record Edith Cross has created and your own testimony, you have the basis for a significant civil action. Virginia looked at Joel, who was listening with that steady attentiveness he brought to everything. Do it, she said. Do it, Joel confirmed, and then checked himself because this was not his decision and looked at her. He said what I said, Virginia said. Holt looked between them with the expression of someone who has gathered more information than he was asked for. Very well, he said, but even with the legal situation moving in her direction, the days were not entirely safe, and Cutter was not a man who simply accepted a setback. 2 weeks into the legal process, someone cut her fence on the east side in 3 places overnight, and she lost one of her cattle to the open range. She did not find the animal. Joel was methodical about the security of the property, which meant walking the fence line every evening and every morning, which meant being aware of the sound of the land in a way that was clearly practiced. One night she could not sleep and she looked out the window and saw him at the far corner of the property, standing in the starlight with his hands in his coat pockets, just watching the dark, and she thought about all the nights he had spent watching the dark and being nobodies. She brought him coffee the next morning and said, You do not have to patrol the property every night. Someone should, he said. It does not have to be you, she said. He looked at her. I would rather it was me, he said. She held his gaze and felt the vertigo of it, the particular sensation of looking at someone and seeing that they are seeing you back with the same quality of attention. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a long time. The November wind moved through the cottonwood trees at the edge of the property, the one she and Thomas had planted in the first spring. "Because this place matters," he said finally. "And because you matter, and because being the person who is here between you and whatever is coming feels like the first honest employment I have had in a long time." She put the coffee down on the fence post between them and stood with her arms crossed against the cold and looked at him. "Joel," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what I said about being useful, not good. I am not trying to reframe that. I am just trying to be accurate." "I think you are the most rigorously honest person I have ever met," she said, "and I grew up around people who thought honesty was a courtesy you performed in certain company. You are honest like it is something you owe the world regardless of whether the world deserves it." He looked at her with something undone in his expression, something that was not quite surprise but was the near neighbor of it. "That is a generous way to read it," he said. "It is the accurate way," she said. She picked up the coffee and offered it to him again. "Drink your coffee, Rhodes." He took it, and his fingers brushed hers on the cup, and neither of them mentioned it. But the space between them had shifted again, had gotten smaller, and this time it did not resettle. 3 weeks into November, Holt filed the motion to dismiss Cutter's fabricated claim, and the response was immediate. Cutter's attorneys filed a counter-motion, but it was thin, and everyone who looked at it could see that the fraud had made it thin. And the county recorder, whose name was Ferris and who it turned out had been uncomfortable with Cutter's influence for years, but who had lacked the specific occasion to oppose it, cooperated fully with Holt's documentation requests. Virginia went to town the day the motion was filed and ran into Garrett on the main street, Cutter's man, the one with the gravel voice. He looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but occupied a position that required elements of both. "You are making a lot of enemies," he said. "I had them already," she said. "I am simply making the situation legible." He tipped his hat and walked on. She told Joel that evening, and he said, "Garrett is not the true danger. Decker is." "Why?" "Because Garrett thinks in terms of his employer's interests. Decker thinks in terms of his own." This proved relevant. A week later, Joel came back from the fence line on the east side with a different quality of alertness in his face, and he said quietly, "There were 2 men in the tree line for most of the afternoon. They were not moving. They were watching. Watching the house. Watching the house." She felt the cold of it that had nothing to do with November. "Decker," she said, "I believe so. He has calculated that the legal route is failing and he is looking for another angle." "What angle?" Joel looked at her levelly. "An angle that does not involve courtrooms." She sat down at the kitchen table and looked at her hands. They were steady, which pleased her because she was less steady on the inside. She thought about what Thomas would have done and could not quite construct the answer, because Thomas had been a good man in the straightforward way that was wonderful in peacetime, and that she did not know how to model in this specific kind of danger. She thought about what she would do, which was stay. "What do we do?" she said. "We make the watching visible," Joel said. "I am going to ride to Barrow Creek tomorrow and speak to the marshal, not because Hatcher will help, but because the conversation will become known and Decker will understand that his surveillance has been noted. And if he moves anyway, then we deal with it directly," Joel said. "But men like Decker prefer darkness. Light is an obstacle." She looked at him across the kitchen. This man who had arrived on her road 6 weeks ago with blood on his collar and nowhere to be. And she thought about all the darkness he had navigated in his own life, all the compromised employment and the leaving and the somewhere worse than here calculations. And she thought about the moment he had said this place matters. And she thought that there was a difference between a man who does dark things because he cannot see another way and a man who does light things because he has simply never been given a reason. She was maybe his reason. The thought was very large and she handled it carefully. "Joel," she said. He looked at her. "What do you want to do after this is over?" He was still for a moment. After this. After Cutter is managed and the legal situation is resolved and the land is secured, what do you want to do? I have not thought that far, he said, and she could see that was honest. I am asking you to think about it, she said. He looked at her with the full, unguarded attention that he had been giving her since the beginning, but that now felt different. That felt like a door opening from the inside. Virginia, he said. I know, she said. I know it is too early, and I know you have reasons for the way you live, and I know I am asking something complicated. But I'm a plain-speaking woman, and I have run out of capacity to be indirect about this, so I am going to say it clearly. He waited. I do not want you to leave, she said. Not when this is over. Not because of the land or the situation or the usefulness. Because I have sat across from you at that table for 6 weeks and I cannot imagine sitting there alone again. And I have been sitting there alone for 2 years and I know what alone feels like, and this is different. You are different. And I think you know it. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and stood in front of her and put his hands very carefully on either side of her face, and she looked up at him, and he looked at her like she was something he had believed did not exist. I am not a good man, he said, low and serious. You are a good enough man, she said. He kissed her then, and it was not tentative. It was the kiss of someone who has finally reached a place he had not known he was looking for, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart beating and thought, yes, this is the thing. They stayed in the kitchen a long time after that, talking in a way they had not talked before, without the tactical layer, without the management of information. He told her about Tennessee, about his mother who had endured and who had died when he was 17 without him there, and how that had shaped the geography of his guilt. She told him about Virginia, the state, the family, the series of choices that had brought her west, and the thing she had never told Thomas, which was that she had not wanted to come west initially. She had wanted to stay in Virginia and build something in the place she knew, and she had come west for Thomas's dream and had made it her own and had never regretted it, but she had never said the first part out loud. He listened to that with the quality of attention that means someone is hearing not just the words but everything between them. You are remarkable, he said quietly. She raised her eyebrows. I am a farmer who cannot harvest her own corn, she said. You are a woman who has built a life alone in a place that killed the man she built it with, who refused to be bought or frightened, who told a complete stranger the truth and asked him to stay, he said. That is remarkable. She looked at him for a long moment. Stay, she said. Stay here. Yes, he said, as if it were the simplest word in the language and he had just now discovered it. The legal proceedings moved through December with the grinding patience of territorial courts, and Holt proved as good as his reputation. On the 14th of December, 1882, the county court dismissed Cutter's fabricated prior claim with prejudice and issued a formal finding that the deed manipulation had been fraudulent. This in itself was not the end of Cutter. Men like Silas Cutter do not end easily, but it was a decisive structural defeat, the kind that requires recalibration. 2 days after the ruling, Decker appeared at the property for the last time. He came alone, which was either foolish or deliberately symbolic, and he sat his horse at the fence line and looked at Joel, who was standing in the yard, and said, Mr. Cutter is moving on. I am glad to hear it, Joel said. The legal failure is a setback, Decker said. Not a defeat. The civil suit that Miss Bristol's attorney is preparing for filing in January might add to his perspective on that, Joel said. Decker looked at him with the cold calculation of a man who has spent a career making other people's decisions for them. You should understand, he said, that your visible involvement in this will follow you. People in this territory remember. So do I, Joel said. I will remember the fabricated claim, the fence cutting, the harassment of a widow on her own land, and the man who employed you to do all of it. If any of that needs to be repeated in a court of law, I am available. Decker's jaw tightened. He looked at the house, where Virginia was visible through the kitchen window, and then he turned his horse and rode south, and he did not come back. The civil suit, when it was filed in January 1883, named Cutter's operation in 3 specific instances of fraud, trespass, and tortious interference with business. Cutter's attorneys settled 2 months later for a sum that was not, Virginia reflected, justice in any grand cosmic sense, but was substantial enough to represent a genuine accountability, and came with an agreement that Cutter's operation would make no further claims against the Bristol property or the water rights. The last entry in the Barrow Creek Courier's coverage of the matter, published in March 1883, read simply that the Bristol Spring matter had been resolved in Miss Bristol's favor, and noted that the outcome was a demonstration of what legal persistence and community record-keeping could accomplish against even well-resourced intimidation. Edith Cross did not mention Joel Rhodes by name, but she did note that Miss Bristol had benefited from the loyalty of dependable friends, and winked when she said so. Winter on the Kansas prairie was a different country than autumn, white and silent and enormous, the sky pressing down on the land in a way that was not threatening, but was simply a fact of enormous scale. Virginia had learned in her first winter here how to understand it, how to find within its silence not loneliness but a kind of enforced clarity, the stripping away of everything that was not essential. Joel learned this in that winter, his first winter with a place to be. He had never wintered in one spot, had always moved ahead of it, and the experience of staying, of watching the snow come and the fields go under, and the farmhouse become the whole world in the way that farmhouses do when the weather makes the outside impossible, was new to him in a way that he found he had no adequate vocabulary for. He found it in work, and in the evenings, and in the steady company of Virginia Bristol. They were not people who moved slowly once they had decided. The winter gave them time together in the enclosed way of a farmhouse in snow, reading and talking and working through the endless smaller repairs and tasks that a farm requires even in its dormant season. And by February, they knew each other in the thorough and unhurried way that cold and proximity and honesty make possible. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday in February, not with grand ceremony, but with the same plain-spoken directness she had been bringing to everything since the moment they met. They were at the harvest table, where most of the important things between them seemed to happen, and he said, without preamble, "I would like to marry you, Virginia, if you are willing." She looked at him across the table and felt the warmth of it fill her chest completely. "I am willing," she said. They were married in March 1883 at the small church in Barrow Creek, with Edith Cross and Ellis, the feed store owner, and Reverend Price, and a dozen other people from the community who had followed the events of the preceding months and felt some proprietary interest in a happy outcome. Alma Garrett, the postmistress, cried, which she explained to anyone who asked was simply a weather-related irritation of the eyes. Joel Rhodes wore the only suit he owned, which he had purchased in Barrow Creek the week before, and he stood at the front of the church with the same composed stillness he brought to everything, except that his eyes, when Virginia came down the aisle in her good blue dress that she had made herself from fabric she had been saving for 2 years, did something they had never quite done in the months she had known him, which was simply give everything away. All of it. Whatever he had been protecting in there, whatever careful management of hope and vulnerability he had been operating with since Tennessee and Colorado and every road in between, it was simply gone, and there was just this, just her, and it was entirely visible, and she loved him so much in that moment that the feeling had nowhere to go except to stand very still and let her eyes fill. Reverend Price performed the ceremony with appropriate economy, the Reverend being a man who understood that the important things had already happened between people by the time they arrived at the church, and the church was just the public accounting. At the reception, which was held at the town hall and which featured food contributed by half the community in a generous acknowledgement that Virginia Bristol had stood up for what was right, and that mattered to people even when they could not say so directly, Joel was approached by Ellis, the feed store owner, a round and forthright man of 60. "You staying on?" Ellis said. On her land. My land too now, Joel said. He said it simply, not defensively, and Ellis looked at him and saw in his face something that satisfied whatever the question had actually been about. Good, Ellis said. We need people around here who don't frighten easy. Spring came the way it always does on the Kansas prairie, as a slow conviction rather than a sudden event, the land warming from the ground up, the first green appearing in the fields before the last frost had entirely left the mornings. Virginia and Joel planted together, which was a different experience for both of them, the coordinated labor of two people who know each other's capabilities and trust the division. Joel turned out to have a genuine feeling for farming, which surprised him more than it surprised Virginia. She watched him with the spring planting and saw in him the same thing she had seen Thomas discover, that agreement with the land, that sense of having made a bargain that was worth honoring. When he came in from the field in the evenings, he brought that quality with him, that specific satisfaction that belongs to people who have spent their day doing something that was worth doing. You look happy, she told him one April evening. He considered the word with the seriousness he brought to everything. I think I am, he said. It is unfamiliar. I hope it becomes familiar, she said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her in the unceremonious way that people who have been married 3 weeks and are still slightly astonished by the proximity of each other do, and she laughed against his mouth and put her hands in his hair. By summer, she knew she was pregnant, and she told him on a Sunday morning in June while they were eating breakfast at the harvest table, the windows open to the warm air and the sound of the birds in the cottonwood trees. He went still in that way he had, the thinking stillness, but this time his face did something else entirely while it was still, something that she watched with tremendous attention. Virginia, he said. Yes, she said, simply, confirming. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his, and she looked at him, and he looked at her with an expression that was composed of so many things she could not categorize them, except that underneath all of them, at the bottom of it, was a pure and uncomplicated joy of the kind that she suspected he had not allowed himself in a very long time and perhaps had not believed he deserved. Are you frightened? He asked. A little, she said. Are you? Considerably, he said. She put her palm against his cheek and he leaned into it like a man who has finally stopped bracing against something. We will manage it, she said. We will, he said. We will manage everything. Their son was born in February of 1884, a cold, clear night with the stars very bright above the Kansas plain, and they named him Thomas Joel Rhodes, the first name for the man who had built the foundation of this life, and the second for the man who had stayed to tend it. He was a robust and emphatic child from the very first hour, with Virginia's green-brown eyes and Joel's stillness when he slept. And the combination of the two struck them both as so perfect that they spent a considerable amount of his first day simply watching him breathe with the focused wonder of people who cannot quite believe the thing that has happened. Edith Cross printed a small notice in the Courier. Thomas Joel Rhodes, born to Mr. and Mrs. Joel Rhodes, a welcome addition to the county. Alma Garrett, the postmistress, said she had something in her eyes again. Joel wrote a letter to his sister in Tennessee, the only family he was still in contact with, a woman named Clara who had stayed where he had left and had built a life there with her own family. He had written to her twice in 6 years before this, both times briefly and without much detail. This letter was 4 pages, and he told her about the farm and about Virginia and about Thomas Joel, and he told her that he would like for her to come visit when she was able. Clara wrote back within the month, and the letter was warm and slightly astonished, and she said she would come in the summer. That summer, when Thomas was 5 months old and the fields were growing strongly, Virginia and Joel had their first real argument, which was about money, specifically about whether to apply the settlement funds from the Cutter case toward expanding the acreage or toward improving the existing infrastructure. And it was a genuine disagreement of the kind that requires two people to have genuinely different instincts about risk and investment. Virginia wanted the acreage. Joel wanted the well. They were at the harvest table, which was where they did everything, and the argument was not angry, but it was earnest, and it went on for a long time, and Thomas slept through most of it in his cradle by the hearth, which Joel pointed out was perhaps an editorial comment on their debate. Virginia told him that was not helpful. Joel said he knew it was not helpful, and that was why he said it, because he was in a losing position and he was trying to change the subject. She looked at him. He looked at her. And then she started laughing, because it was so entirely characteristic of him to say exactly that. And he was laughing too, and the argument was over, though not resolved. And they went back to it seriously the next morning and eventually landed on a compromise that incorporated elements of both positions, which was how all the best decisions between them got made. Clara came in July with her husband and 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5, and the visit was one of the best weeks Virginia could remember. Clara was a warm and practical woman with Joel's gray eyes and a forthright manner that Virginia liked immediately, and she held Thomas for about 6 consecutive hours on the first day while he regarded her with the calm appraisal of an infant conducting a detailed investigation. Joel and his brother-in-law sat on the porch in the evenings and talked in the easy way that people who have been vouched for by someone they both love can talk, and Virginia watched Joel from the kitchen window, watching him be comfortable with family, with his own family, and felt a satisfaction that was bigger than happiness, that was something more like rightness. Clara, on the last evening before they left, found Virginia alone in the kitchen and said, without preamble, "He is different." "Different from when?" Virginia said. "From every letter he ever wrote," Clara said, "which were not many and were not long and told very little. But what they told, the person in them was someone who had decided that good things were not for him." Virginia was quiet. "He is not that anymore," Clara said, "whatever you did." "I asked him to stay," Virginia said. Clara looked at her with Joel's gray eyes. "That was exactly the right thing," she said. The years settled themselves in the way that good years do, each one distinct but part of a continuous pattern, like the annual rings in a tree that you can read individually, but that are also just the tree being itself through time. The farm grew and improved. Virginia expanded the cornfield in the 2nd year, and Joel built the new well infrastructure in the 3rd, so they both turned out to be right, which they each found satisfying in their own way. The water from the spring continued to flow, clear and steady, as it had always flowed, indifferent to the drama that had been conducted on its behalf, which was appropriate. In the spring of 1886, their daughter was born, and they named her Clara Ann Rhodes, the first name for Joel's sister and the middle name for Virginia's mother. She arrived in the world with a forceful opinion about everything, which she expressed clearly and immediately, and which did not diminish with time. Joel, who had been composed about most things in his life, was entirely undone by his daughter within the first week, and made no effort to conceal it, which Virginia found more endearing than she had words for. He was good with both children in the specific way that surprised people who knew only the surface of him, patient and deliberate and genuinely engaged, willing to sit on the floor for extended periods being instructed in the proper method of arranging various objects, which was how 3-year-old Thomas spent considerable portions of his days. He read to them in the evenings, which was how Virginia first learned that he had a beautiful reading voice, low and precise and compelling, and she would sometimes sit in the doorway of the children's room just to listen to him read, not to the children but to herself, to the sound of that voice that had said, "I am not a good man," and had been wrong about that in the most fundamental and instructive way. Silas Cutter died in the summer of 1886, of a heart failure that his neighbors reported he had been denying for 2 years. His operation was absorbed by various creditors and by a younger generation of his family who were more interested in cattle than in hydraulic politics, and the spring on Virginia's land continued to matter to no one, except the people who lived beside it, which was as it should be. Decker disappeared from the county sometime in 1885. Virginia heard from Edith Cross that he had gone to Colorado, and she thought about what Joel had told her of Colorado and about the patterns of men who do other people's damage for them. And she hoped he found something different there and believed he probably had not, and filed the thought under the general heading of things she could not change and moved on. Marshall Hatcher retired in 1884 and was replaced by a man named Cole who had come recommended from Wichita and who turned out to be straightforward and competent, which was a relief to everyone who had learned to navigate Hatcher's flexible jurisdiction. In 1887, Ellis, the feed store owner, fell ill and asked Joel if he would be willing to take on a part ownership of the business, as his sons were not interested and he did not want to see it close. Joel talked to Virginia about it at the harvest table one evening, presenting it with his usual careful factuality, the financial requirements, the time commitment, the implications for the farm. She looked at him across the table and thought about the man who had appeared on her road 5 years ago with nowhere to go and blood on his collar. "What do you want?" she said. He considered it seriously. "I think I want to say yes," he said. "I think I have been wanting to build something in a town, in a community, and this is an opportunity to do that." "Then say yes," she said. "It means more time in Barrow Creek." "We can manage that," she said. "We manage everything, remember." He looked at her with the full and open expression that had become his ordinary face in the years of their life together, all the careful management dissolved by simple, sustained happiness. "Yes," he said. "We do." He took on the partnership with Ellis, who recovered enough to come in 3 days a week, and who taught Joel the business with the patient generosity of an older man who has found the right person to pass something to. The feed store became something Joel was proud of in the straightforward way that Thomas Bristol had been proud of the land, because he had put himself into it, and it was giving something back. Virginia expanded the farming operation in the years that followed, eventually hiring 2 permanent hands and managing the enterprise with the methodical intelligence that had gotten her through the Cutter situation, and that her children would later describe as the single most useful thing they had inherited from her. By 1890, the Bristol Rhodes farm was one of the most productive in Garfield County, which was noted by the Courier in its year-end summary, and which Virginia read with the private satisfaction of someone who had been told 6 years ago that $2,000 was a generous offer for what she had built. She thought sometimes about the moment Joel had sat at her harvest table and said what he had said, the strange and vulnerable offering of it, "I am not a good man, but I am a useful one," and the way it had opened everything that came after. She thought about what it must have cost him to say it, to offer the diminished version of himself before she could discover it and be disappointed, to give her the truth first and let her decide what to do with it. She had decided, as it turned out, to marry him, which was not what he had been offering, or rather was not what he had thought he was offering, but was what the truth of him had made available. One evening in the autumn of 1891, 9 years after a drifter had knocked on her door asking for water, Virginia sat at the harvest table watching Joel come in from the field with Thomas, who was 7 now, and beginning to develop his father's economy of motion. Young Clara was at the table with her, supposedly helping shell the last of the autumn peas, but mostly conducting a forensic investigation of each individual pea before releasing it into the bowl. Joel came through the door and Thomas ran immediately to the bowl of peas and stole one, which Clara protested with full force of her personality. "That is mine," Clara said. "I have been working on that pea." "You have been looking at it," Thomas said. "That is working," Clara said. Virginia raised her eyebrows at Joel. He set his hat on the hook by the door and crossed the kitchen and kissed her, and she put her hand on his arm. "Good day," she said. "Very good," he said. "Ellis is talking about expanding the store. I told him we should discuss it." "We should," she said. "At this table," he said. "Obviously," she laughed. "Obviously." The fire was burning in the hearth, and the children were arguing over the peas with the focused creativity that well-loved children bring to argument. And the October wind was moving outside over the fields that were harvested, all harvested, not a single ear left standing past its time. The two cottonwood trees at the edge of the property were nearly bare now, dropping their last yellow leaves in the last light of the afternoon. Joel sat down at the table, and Clara immediately climbed into his lap without interrupting her argument with Thomas, which she was conducting with one hand and with her full conversational attention. He put his arm around her automatically and looked at Virginia over the top of their daughter's head. She looked at him. She thought about all the roads he had traveled to arrive at this particular chair at this particular table. She thought about the man who had believed for 30 years that he was not a good man, not entitled to a place, not part of the kind of agreement that he had told her on the road to Barrow Creek that he had never had with anything. She thought about how wrong he had been, and how long it had taken for circumstances to prove it, and how grateful she was to the prairie and to the October road, and to the unharvested corn that had made her look up from the field at the right moment. She thought, this is what a life is supposed to feel like, not the absence of hardship or fear or the complicated negotiations of two genuinely different people working out how to share a world, but this. The fire, the children, the harvest in. The man at the table who had said, I am not a good man, and had spent every day since doing nothing but contradicting that assessment. She took the peas from Clara with calm authority and finished shelling them herself, because if she waited for Clara to finish they would not have dinner until midnight. I have been thinking, she said, about the acreage on the east side. Again, Joel said. Still, she said, what about it? I think we should plant it in winter wheat this year, she said. The market is good, and Holt tells me there are buyers in Wichita who are looking for long-term supply contracts. Joel looked at her with the focused assessment he gave all practical proposals, working through the logistics. Thomas had given up on the pea dispute and was now drawing something on a piece of paper he had produced from somewhere, very seriously, with his tongue between his teeth. The east field needs one more season of preparation, Joel said, but if we start in spring, we could plant late wheat in September. That is what I thought, Virginia said. Then yes, he said, let us do it. She met his eyes across the table, and he looked at her with everything that was between them, the 9 years and the 2 children and the legal battles and the winter snows and the harvests and the arguments and the mornings when the land was beautiful and the evenings when it was enough just to be in the same room, all of it in the gray depth of his eyes. You know, he said quietly, while Clara was occupied with taking back her peas, I told you I was not a good man. You did, she said. I have been reconsidering that position, he said. Have you? I think I may have been operating with incomplete information, he said very seriously, and she could see the humor beneath the seriousness, his particular kind. What information was missing, she said. He looked at her. The part where someone shows you what you are when you are being your best self, he said. Most people spend their whole lives not having that. She held his gaze and felt the warmth of it move through her completely. You showed me first, she said. At the table, when you said what you said. I said I was not a good man. You told me the truth, she said, when you could have said nothing, when you could have been whoever you needed to be to stay employed. You chose the truth instead, and you let me decide what to do with it. And you decided to be impossible to ignore, he said. She smiled. I decided to ask you to stay, she said. Everything else followed from that. Everything else, he said, and looked around the kitchen, at the children and the fire and the harvest table and the window beyond which the last gold leaves were falling from the cottonwood trees. Everything else, he said again, quietly, as if he were taking inventory and finding it good. Thomas looked up from his drawing and held it up for inspection. It was a picture of the farm, executed in the slightly approximate style of a 7-year-old with genuine spatial instincts, the farmhouse and the barn and 2 trees and what appeared to be a version of every family member, including the dog they had acquired the previous spring. Look, Thomas said, that is all of us. Virginia looked at it. Joel looked at it. That is exactly all of us, Virginia said. She reached across the table and took Joel's hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers. And outside, the October wind moved over the Kansas plain that was theirs, that held the spring they had fought for, that bore the wheat they would plant and the corn they would harvest, and the life they had built on the foundation of a single honest sentence said at a harvest table on a cold November night a long time ago. In the years that followed, they would welcome one more child into the house, another son born in 1893, who they named Will after nobody in particular, but because the name suited him, which was the best possible reason for a name. Will turned out to be the one most like Virginia, dark-eyed and quietly determined, with her practical intelligence and her refusal to be intimidated, which Joel regarded with the particular pride of a man who knows exactly what that quality is worth. The farm continued to grow, carefully, one season at a time, as farms do when the people tending them understand that growth is not a thing you force but a thing you tend. The east field went in winter wheat, and the yields were good, and the supply contract with the Wichita buyers held for 3 years and was renewed. The feed store in Barrow Creek expanded twice, and Joel took on 2 employees, and became one of those people in a community who are known not because they seek attention, but because they are reliably there, reliably competent, reliably honest, which turns out to be rarer than any other quality and more valued. He and Edith Cross became genuine friends, which he had not expected, and which she probably had, because she had seen clearly from the beginning what kind of man he was even before he fully knew it himself. They argued about politics and about the newspaper business and about the direction of the county with the comfortable ferocity of people who respect each other's thinking even when they disagree with it. Virginia and Alma Garrett, the postmistress, had coffee together on alternate Wednesdays for the better part of 15 years. Through Alma's retirement and her succession by a young man from Ohio, who gradually became part of the community's fabric as all outsiders eventually do in places that need workers more than they need purity of origin. The harvest table itself, the worn oak table at which so much had happened, at which Joel had said the sentence that had started everything, and at which so many subsequent sentences had been said, persisted through all of it. It acquired new marks over the years, the circular imprint of a coffee cup that Virginia never got around to sealing, a long shallow gouge where 8-year-old Clara had been less careful with a kitchen knife than she should have been, the small precise scratches left by Thomas's drawing projects over multiple years. It was a table that contained a life in its surface, and Virginia had no intention of ever replacing it. On the 20th anniversary of the day Joel Rhodes had appeared on her road, Virginia set the harvest table for dinner with the good china she used on significant occasions, the set that had come west with her from Virginia packed in straw, that had survived the journey without a single crack, that she had been using for important dinners for 26 years. Thomas was 26 now and working land of his own, 2 counties over, with a wife named Ruth who was brisk and funny, and whom Virginia had liked within the first 10 minutes of meeting her. Clara was 21 and studying in Wichita at the new normal school, where she was preparing to become a teacher with the determined efficiency with which she did everything, and who wrote letters home every week without fail. Will was 13 and at the table, along with Thomas and Ruth who had come for the occasion, and Joel was at the hearth adding wood to the fire because October had come around again, and it was getting cold. She looked at the table, set with the good china, and thought about the first time they had eaten at it together, the bread she had made and the cold beans and the coffee, and the man across from her who had not yet said anything except that he could harvest and would work for barn lodging, and the almost visible weight of everything he was carrying without a place to put it down. She thought about what she had known even then and had not admitted to herself for weeks, which was that he was going to matter. She had always been honest about most things, but about that she had allowed herself a comfortable interval of not knowing, because she was recently widowed and not ready, and also because the situation with Cutter demanded her full attention. She had given herself permission to not know for exactly as long as it was sustainable, and then she had spoken. Joel came away from the hearth and sat down at the head of the table where he always sat now, and looked at the good china with some surprise. "What occasion is this?" he said. She looked at him across the length of the table, and Will was talking to Thomas about something, and Ruth was laughing at whatever it was, and the fire was burning, and outside the October wind was doing what it had always done over this particular stretch of Kansas plain. 20 years since you sat at this table and said something very honest to me," she said. He was still for a moment. And then something moved across his face, warm and complete, the expression she had been watching for 20 years, and that still made the same thing happen in her chest that it had made happen the first time. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "And I have spent 20 years proving you wrong about the first part. You have been very thorough about it," he said. She looked at him, he looked at her. And around them, the children and the fire and the October night, and the farm that was theirs, that had always been theirs. From the moment a drifter with blood on his collar and nowhere to go had pulled up on the road, and asked if she needed help, and she had said yes. "I do," without knowing yet what kind of help or how completely or for how long, or that the answer to all of those questions was going to be the best answer she had ever given to anything. "I love you," she said, across the harvest table in front of the children and the fire and 20 years of evidence. "I love you, Virginia," he said. "I have loved you since before I knew what to do with it." "Since when?" she said. He thought about it with the deliberateness he always gave to questions that deserved actual answers. "Since you were standing at the edge of the cornfield in October," he said, furious at it, "and you turned and looked at me without any fear or any pretense and asked me one single practical question. 'Can you harvest?' she said. 'Can you harvest?' he said. You were not asking about me. You were asking about my usefulness, which is the most honest thing one person can ask another." She smiled at that. "And you said you had before." "I said I had before," he said, which was technically true and deliberately incomplete. "Like everything you said for the first 3 days," she said. "Like everything," he agreed. "And then you asked for the whole truth and I gave it to you and you did not leave the table." "I did not leave the table," she said. "That," he said quietly and with everything, "is when I knew. The fire burned. The wind moved outside. The good china caught the firelight and held it." Will was making Thomas explain something for the third time with patient thoroughness, and Ruth was watching this with the fond amusement of someone still in the early years of being part of this family, and finding it better than she had expected. Virginia looked at her husband across the harvest table where everything important had happened between them, and she thought that she would not change a single piece of it, not the fear or the danger or the cold November nights or the arguments or the years of alone before him, because all of it had led here to this table, to this man, to this life that was theirs. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.